social. With our two countries facing similar challenges, but also with a broader shared commitment to the rules-based order and to bilateral, regional, minilateral and multilateral action to combat these shared challenges, now is an opportune time to bring together academics in both countries to apply their knowledge, to take a historiographical approach as recommended by the Minister, to look to the past to find our answers for the future in an area of direct community benefit. So we wish you well in your discussions today. On a brief personal note, I'd like to thank George and Yassinos particularly, both for your professional commitment to community safety, but also for your personal friendship over the last few years that I've been here in Cyprus. As I said, we wish you well in your deliberations, and we look forward particularly to the opportunity to support further collaboration in this important field. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you. Once again, Your Excellency, High Commissioner, Mr. Behaviour, sincere thanks. You have also underlined the importance of community safety, resilience, and you have framed it indeed under the governance and policy making within the Sendai framework and disaster risk reduction in general. Ladies and gentlemen, physically present here and those kindly following us from the web, we do not thank the welcome addresses just because we have to. But as academic researchers and as practitioners, I believe you will agree with me, we have been privileged not with political fanfares here, but indeed with the remarks of two doers who have indeed underlined how science and policy can interact. So indeed, thank you, Your Excellencies, both Minister Mr. Christodoulidis and High Commissioner Mr. Behaviour. Indeed, your remarks are to be thanked, not just because we have to, but because indeed they were useful and underlining and showing indeed the way to go in our collaboration with Australia, but also, as Minister Christodoulidis mentioned, in the region, Europe, and further away. Indeed, let us now speak as researchers and scientists and practitioners. We will move on with our day 2 now of our #DPM 2021 event. And indeed, our first speaker presenter for today will be from the Victorian Country Fire Authority, who will speak to us about actions, programs, and indeed lessons learned in the 10 years since the Royal Commission into Black Saturday. Our first speaker for our day 2 is none other than Mr. Michael Bourne. Mr. Bourne, the virtual podium, over to you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies and learned friends. I'll just share my screen now. I think that's coming through.
Indeed.
Do we have the bushfires in Southeast Australia? And it picks up very much on the theme, learning from the past, lessons for the future. So today I bring to the conference a background in community safety, road safety, crime prevention, a variety of applications of the public health model to improving public safety in a variety of forms. And now as manager of the CFA Knowledge and Evidence team, I'm looking to apply those principles in relation to fire safety. And that's where the collaboration with MUARC has grown in recent years. I've worked with MUARC for decades in the road safety area and other areas, and very pleased to continue that collaboration in our current role. So as a lifelong learner, I'm looking forward to today's proceedings to learn as much as I can offer. I'll cover 3 topics briefly today. in relation to actions, programs and lessons learned in the 10 years since the Royal Commission. Firstly, the lead up to and the action taken after the devastating fires on 7 February 2009. Then look at the Bushfires Program evaluation, the findings there in relation to the changes in CFA and community. And then look at continuing actions that flow after 2015 when the Bushfires Program concluded. In the face, though, of the many factors that Your Excellencies have referred to in terms of the frequency and intensity of fires and the importance of regional and international multilateralism linking in with local action and local solutions for local problems. I've been with CFA now for 10 years and managed the Enterprise Program Management Office for the last year of the Bushfires Program. So I was very closely involved with the projects, and then after that managed the evaluation of the program, now managing the research and evidence programs. So firstly, a little bit about CFA. Hopefully that will, no, it's for some reason not, there we go. So CFA at a glance. It's a large organisation, over 55,000 members, volunteer members, and 800 plus staff, distributed across 1,200 plus locations across the state and divided into districts and regions. But importantly, picking up on the comments so far, covering all phases of the emergency management spectrum: prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And I note preparedness termed, I think, mitigation in your context, that I imagine covering the same risk and evidence-based approach to reducing the likelihood and impact of fires. CFA is not just a fire agency. There's also emergency management, emergency medical response, road crash rescue, and a variety of other community service provider roles. Now I'd like to note some similarities between your country and Victoria. Like Victoria, Cyprus has a large forest and mountain region surrounded by farming lands and scrub, with many towns and villages. So the very large mountain areas and bush areas surrounded by grasslands and scrub. In relation to Victoria, similar topography with a very large area of bushland, forest, and large, and including other areas of the state, as part of a great dividing range that moves up the east coast of Australia, together with some pasture lands, croplands, and indeed some desert, and a large area of grasslands and farming, with lots of villages dotted across all these areas. As was noted, Australia is subject to a number of different kinds of disasters, a very large number, and many of those relate to bushfires, particularly in the southeast corner of Australia, in Victoria and the southern part of New South Wales. And many of those are in Victoria. And we see a number of them in the areas to the north and east of Melbourne, the capital, the major population centre, together with a number in East Gippsland and West Gippsland. Okay. We note also that there has been recent experience of devastating fire in Cyprus, as recent as this year, just some months ago. And we offer our condolences and support to the people who have suffered as a result of those fires. Bushfires are termed by the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience as an unplanned vegetation fire, with the generic term including grass, forest and scrub fires. And bushfires are very important in the Australian context. The forests of Australia have evolved to live with fire and to, in many cases, rely on fire for their development. But we know that bushfires can significantly impact whole communities, disrupt people's lives and their businesses, and take away many of our environmental amenities that we enjoy. Long history of reviews into bushfires in Australia, going back as far as the Stretton Review in 1939 with Black Friday fires. And then Ash Wednesday, 83, a variety of others over the years. I'll be talking a little today about the 2009 Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, and I'm sure if people are looking for details, we can give you the links to the various details of each of those. And Your Excellency, the High Commissioner referred to the outworkings of a recent national inquiry delivering bushfire reform after the devastating fires of the 2019-20 fire season. In the lead up to 7 February 2009, Victoria and Southeast Australia had suffered quite a significant prolonged drought. Long decades of droughts in Australia, but usually with fairly rapid recovery. So these are the water storage levels in the Melbourne water supply system. And you can see here from a peak of 96 to fall to, if we take that in a bit more detail, from a peak of 96% in 1997 to fall to 26% in 2009. Very dry period throughout Southeast Australia. And with that background, and looking at going into the summer of 2008, the vegetation across the state had already significantly cured before summer began. And when we look at the same map in relation to the 2nd of February, by the beginning of February, virtually the whole of the state was tinder dry, just waiting for the sorts of conditions that might lead to ignitions and fires. All it needed was another hot day with low humidity, and there would be lots of fires across Victoria. And indeed, on the 7th of February 2009, there was a number of fires in Victoria and other parts of Australia. On that day, there was over 300 fires started across Victoria. Most of those, in fact, almost all of those, were put out very quickly before they became large fires. Well, they were still less than 5 hectares, saving countless lives and properties. But the feature of the reporting at the time and the reviews since focused very heavily on the losses. And there were 13 fires on that day that got away, as they say, and 4 of those led to deaths. 173 fatalities, countless injuries and massive losses across whole towns, businesses, local environment, animal habitat and physical infrastructure. In fact, one single fire on the 7th led to 159 of those 173 deaths. But picking up on Your Excellency's comments earlier in terms of value for money and investment in the right places, it's important that we understand the effectiveness of the fires in terms of losses avoided, not just the response to the fires that have to be taken on when they get large, but what about all those saves and losses avoided? And we need to find a way to bring that into the equation as well. We've been doing some work on that, which I can speak on later if you wish. One of the towns significantly impacted by the 2009 fires was Marysville. The town was virtually razed to the ground. Almost all buildings in the town were destroyed, including the local police station, even though the total fire ban sign at the front of the police station was still visible after the fires had passed through. And this photo on the right-hand side, down the bottom there, has been one iconic photo from that era that's travelled across many parts of the world of a CFA volunteer caring for and looking after one of the local inhabitants, of whom many were killed as a result of the fires. By the end of February that year, virtually the whole of the state was 100% cured and 100% ready to ignite into a fire at any point. And indeed, there were further fires during that season which extended beyond the end of February. So what happened in the 2009 fires? This was the worst natural disaster in the state and Australia's history. 173 people lost their lives. 2% of the land area of Victoria was burnt. My mathematics tells me that that's about half of the land area of Cyprus. Over 2,000 properties were destroyed in entire towns like Marysville. There was other towns that were also directly affected. 78 communities in all. All estimated losses over 4 billion. And at the end of the analysis, it was felt that CFA needed a lot more support, and 286 million was allocated for CFA bushfire projects. The VBRC, the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission, noted at the time the impact of these fires are seared into the consciousness of those who lived through them. And the fires of 2009 changed Victoria and CFA forever. So with the allocation of those resources, the bushfires program commenced. In 2009, for 5 years, 65 projects were undertaken across broad themes: planning, community capability, workforce capability, vegetation management, fuel reduction and other aspects, incident management to bolster the capabilities of incident management teams, communications, response capability, and bushfire program management and evaluation. So those 65 projects proceeded over the next 4 years. One of them, and I'll talk about 4 of the projects in a little more detail, some examples of the innovations that have flowed from the bushfires program. You saw the maps earlier, the grassland curing maps. They were fairly chunky. Now the grassland curing network has been expanded. A number of people give their observations weekly into a database, and that database is supplemented by satellite readings, and we now have quite comprehensive and quite locally focused grassland curing maps. This was a couple of days ago. You can see that the northwest is already very dry, but it's a bit different this year. We have floods happening down in the southeast of the state, so we've got a two-speed fire season developing. Already got fires occurring in the northwest and west, and battling some raging rivers and floods in the east. Another area project developed under the bushfires program was fire behaviour modelling, to model the likely impact of a fire. The ignition point on the left-hand side there, what might happen, and what we're very interested in is how do we use this as to identify the difference between what did happen and what could have happened had the fire agency not been able to suppress the fire in the way they did. So it identifies the households that would be impacted and the areas that are likely would have been burnt. And these can be done for scenarios that haven't yet happened or for particular fires to compare the result with what it might otherwise have been. So it provides a very, very strong and detailed local fire planning tool for the behaviour analysts working directly with the incident management teams or with the local planners. Another area of focus at the time of the bushfires program was the concepts of defendable space and defendability. Defendable space is the area of land around a property which is where vegetation is modified or cleared or different planting of different species to reduce the effects of flame contact and radiant heat, to protect the property from the likelihood of being impacted by the fire. And that's an example of modifying the environment, built or natural, to be able to reduce the risk of fires, to mitigate the likely impact of a fire. But there's many other factors that come into whether a fire will impact an area and to what extent. The fire behaviour itself, the weather intensity on the day, and the human factors are very important. To what extent are people who might choose to stay and defend their property actually got the physical and mental capability to do so? Because without being on the day, at the time, in the moment, able to deal with whatever happens, then the firefight can be lost quite easily. And at the time, the options for people was known as stay or go. Stay to defend or leave your property to go to safety. And if you leave in time to be away from the event should it impact your property. So defendability is about being able to stay and defend a property in the event of a bushfire, one aspect of which is whether you have suitable defendable space. But defendability is this very small area in the middle where the three factors coalesce in favour of being able to successfully defend a property. So the fire behaviour has to be of low intensity, the environment has to be well prepared, and you have to be well prepared and capable on the day. So your fire plan will take all those factors into account. But if on the day the fire is more intense than you expect, or you can't find the keys to start the pump, or you can't, because you broke your ankle yesterday, be as active as you might want to be, these things can directly impact whether or not you can have a successful defence of your property. And unfortunately, if people choose to stay and defend and are unsuccessful in that, it leads to people leaving late. And leaving late is one of the most dangerous options in a bushfire, because you're then trying to evacuate the area on crowded roads which are filled with smoke and through fires, very dangerous environment, and there's a lot of rush decision making, and a lot of deaths have occurred as a result of people losing their way in smoke haze or flames and running off the road or having crashes. So the policy was changed to leave early on the basis that rather than staying and defending, the preferred option would be for people to, on the high fire risk days where the danger is very high, would take the option of being out of their property, out of the way of the fire, should the fire front occur. So you've got a situation where people are in a bit of a quandary. Do I leave the night before? Do I leave on the day? Do I leave when I see smoke on the horizon? What point is leave early enough? And what happens if I have some animals that I need to look after? Can't take all the stock with me. What happens if for whatever reason leave early means that I haven't got somewhere to go, so I have to be in town? Or if it's more than one day, can I sustain leave early over a period of time? And refuge shelters can assist in that area. But it's not as simple as saying leave early. So we've been doing a lot of research into what's known as the archetypes for bushfire response and bushfire decision making. And the messages that we're delivering won't necessarily resonate with everybody in every circumstance. So it's a question of understanding the mindset of the people that we're working with at a household and individual level to be able to work with them to develop the best plan for their circumstances. Because there's recognition that leave early has a number of difficulties, but it also means that there's likely to be greater property loss. There'll be less loss of injury, less injuries and loss of life, but likely to be greater property loss. So there's issues for people to contemplate through all of that. But the current policy is around leave early rather than stay or go. That's a significant shift. Our whole approach has been risk-based and evidence-based through all of this work. So picking up on the themes of the previous speakers, it's important to have risk in mind. And one of the initiatives of the Bushfires program was to establish the Victorian Fire Risk Register, which is related to bushfires, to look at the likelihood of fires and the consequence should a fire occur, and assess that in a risk matrix as to extreme, very high, medium. Now, this isn't about fire danger rating. This is about if a fire occurs, is this asset or is this land area at extreme risk or very low risk? This process is a collaborative process with local government and local participants, and the fire agencies talking together about individual areas and assets in their district to then come up with a map of where are the areas of highest risk and how can we use that information in our planning. Shown here, where areas of extreme risk are identified, areas of very high risk or moderate risk or high, coming down through medium and no risk or low risk. So the concept is, in particular, to identify those areas that would need more attention in terms of prevention, preparedness activities, and more attention in terms of vegetation management to be able to reduce fire risk. This is the area around the town of Ballarat, northwest or west of Melbourne, and you can see the large urban environment in the area there, following on into heavily wooded and less heavily wooded areas And there's a lot of housing has been developed in those areas, and those houses are at significant risk, as are the businesses around them. So that's another tool that's assisting the planners and assisting the responders as well. Just talk briefly about the bushfire program evaluation, which was undertaken in 2015. The CFA board commissioned us to do an evaluation of the bushfires program. In 3 parts, we undertook that task over the next 9 months, developing the information base that was necessary to be able to undertake the evaluations, then doing some process evaluations, some effectiveness evaluations, some outcome evaluations, and some value for money. And then bringing all that together with information that we gathered from the field in just talking with over 150 groups of members across Victoria, talking with our partners about the partnerships we're operating. Your Excellencies have identified the importance of partnerships, multilateralism, very important in the agency context of CFA, that we have effective partnerships in place, and then some studies. Bringing all that together into a report which we presented to the board in mid-2016, and that report remains available as a basis, and there's a couple of chapters in there about what we call lessons learned, but we term most of it as lessons identified, not yet fully learned, but they will be as time goes by. So what did we notice had been achieved? Improved identification and management of risk, improved warning systems for communities, improved operational response, enhanced training, improved provision of information to communities, particularly in the preparedness activities, collaborative engagement and integrated planning across agencies, very important for the partnerships, and improved communications and interagency interoperability. So that, and I'll come to that in terms of some of the work that's going on at the moment. We've talked about partnerships, the importance of partnerships. One of the critical partnerships is CFA and Forest Fire Management Victoria. Forest Fire Management Victoria are responsible for fire management on public land, national parks and the like. CFA responsible for fire management on private land. But fires don't discriminate. Fires move across public and private land seamlessly. So it's very important that a tenure blind approach was developed, as it's called. Tenure blind meaning doesn't matter where the fire starts or where it's going, let's interoperable work together to manage the fire and prevent the devastation if we can. And that's particularly in relation to response, incident control, equipment and communications, but also in relation to fuel management and preparation and prevention activities. And as a result of that, a program, a very large program of activity has been developed in the last 3 or 4 years called Safer Together, which looks at the work that CFA and Forest Fire Management Victoria can do together to improve their services to Victorian communities. Community perceptions, very important that we understand what the community is thinking in terms of the services provided and in terms of the organisation, both as a service provider and as an organisation. So community emergency services have shared responsibility. So important to see the balance between responsibility of the agencies and responsibility of members and communities, households, individuals and local government and communities, seeing that as a shared accountability for delivering fire safety. 67%, at least some improvement in the last 5 years. That was in 2015, and 97% regarding CFA as a trusted agency. And that level of trust and respect has persisted in more recent surveys as well. So out of the 65 projects, 60 were delivered within the 4-year time frame, and there were arrangements put in place for the delivery of the remaining 5. And of the implementation plan actions that were required to be delivered by CFA, this is in relation to responding to the recommendations of the Bushfire Royal Commission. 15 of the 16 were delivered by 2015. The remaining action was delivered a couple of years later. So all those 16 actions have now been completed, as noted by the Bushfire Royal Commission Implementation Monitor and subsequently by the Inspector General of Emergency Management. Some further developments that are proceeding at the moment since 2015. A continuing series of post-season surveys to ask communities in high bushfire risk areas about their preparation and preparedness activities and about their response to CFA services. Significant changes in the community warning systems and the introduction of evacuation policies. Significant activity in relation to fuel management and reduction programs, but not just in relation to planned burning, but in relation to other ways of managing vegetation, managing fuel. I mentioned Safer Together, continuing program there to reduce bushfire risk and build capabilities. There's a work proceeding on a new fire danger rating scale, and a network of over 60 automatic fire danger rating signs were introduced across Victoria to provide information to local people in relation to fire danger in their area, but also on major highways and into tourist areas to make sure that people who are visiting those areas had equal or similar information. Very important for tourism. Some further developments as well, extended communication networks, greater sophistication with the introduction of digital communications across the network Victoria, and greater incident control activities there. Air and ground observers, particularly with aerial firefighting capabilities, a large component of helicopters and planes, have been particularly pivotal in bringing fires under control very quickly. So making sure that those small fires are extinguished while they're small, which has the best impact in terms of response, quick response. And then there's a lot of work going on with industry and academic partnerships through the Australian Fire Agency's commission, the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, CFA working with NEWARC, and the Bushfires Natural Hazards CRC, and Natural Hazards Research Australia, which is replacing the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC. So there's a large body of research available for us to use, to draw on, and we do that on a continuing basis. And that helps build the capabilities that we're looking for. Just a quick note on another area, residential fires, which a lot of our activity in the last few years has been focused also on residential fires. We note that over the longer term, you get very significant spikes in the impact of bushfires every 10, 15, 20 years. But over that same period of average out over 30 years, we see that the deaths and injuries from residential fires are in fact greater. And so we've had a renewed focus on looking at the causal and risk factors associated with residential fires. A lot of work that Carlin and Stuart have done with us gives us the information base there, and that has now been converted into a structural version of the fire risk register. So in the same way that we have maps for bushfire, we're now developing maps for the structural component. So not only in the urban environment, but commercial premises in the rural areas and in towns and villages. So a lot of work going on around residential fire safety. Unfortunately, the last season was a significant one for us in Victoria. Summer of 18-19 was Victoria's hottest on record. 28th of February and 1st of March, we had lots of fires already starting, and then over 200, almost 300 grass and scrub fires. So hot weather combined with grassland curing, still leading to very high elevated fire risk. And in the summer of 2019-20, there was significant fires across southeast Australia. And in Victoria, 5 fatalities, 300 houses burned, over 6,000 head of stock lost. That doesn't include the animals in the forests that lost habitat as well as being killed. Mallacoota experienced the greatest ever evacuation of Australian citizens. Part of that was 2,000 people evacuated by air and sea. A number also evacuated by road before the roads were closed. And then large areas of forest and parks and plantations, native timber assets burned. And the overall health burden is more than just fatalities as a direct result of the fires. It's been estimated that the bushfire smoke was associated with 120 more deaths than would normally be expected through that period as a result of cardiovascular or asthma or respiratory problems. So quite significant impact beyond the fatalities directly related to fire. So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to give you some insight into the 2009 fires, the review and the work that's been undertaken since, to learn some of the lessons there and share some of the ideas and developments and innovations that have occurred. And we look forward to being able to assist you to leverage that knowledge and that experience from southeastern Australia, from Victoria, into whatever programs that you're planning to help you build capacity and build capabilities to better manage fires in the future. So thank you very much. And questions or discussion now, or do we come to that later?
Sincere thanks, Mr. Byrne, for your extremely thorough and diligent contribution from the practitioner point of view, from the Victorian Country Fire Authority. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends following us also from the web, please don't forget to follow our hashtag DPM2021 on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and also on Instagram. Moving forward now with our second day of DPM 2021, we will move towards more academic research contributions. I would like to kindly ask dear colleagues from academia and the research realm to, for the sake of time and for the respect of the time zone difference, to please contain your contributions to the 20-minute mark. Without further ado, I would like to invite now to the virtual podium our own Clelia Petru, Ms. Clelia Petru conducts research here at the EUC, at European University Cyprus, and more particularly as a dear colleague within CERIDES, the Center of Excellence in Risk and Decision Sciences. So Clelia will present to us the Aracapas fire, the recent Aracapas fire here in Cyprus, as well as the Fire EU Risk Project, one of our very competitive and very important projects here at CERIDES. So, Clelia, very glad to pass the virtual podium over to you.
Good morning to all. Online and there, also in the uni. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you live there, so let's do this virtually. Okay, let me just check that you can see my full screen and we can start. Great. Okay, so Aracapas fire that happened this summer, 3rd of July 2021. It's characterized and described, especially in the media, as pure health, worst ever, and most destructive. This fire and this kind of characteristics quite a shock, let's say, but thinking that Cyprus is very prone to fire, especially because we have long summers, heat waves, strong winds sometimes, some days during the summertime, and less rain during winter as years pass by. However, this fire, due to its characteristics, it was really, it got those adjectives, especially from the media and the locals, and actually was compared with the fires that happened due to the Turkish invasion in 1974. So that's, you can understand the scale of it. Here is two pictures, before and after, like the very nice and green landscape, and then the black, some months after actually. So you can see a bit of green coming up. Some very popular, couple of popular images that went through those days from the affected areas. These are fires from the fire brigade. So the characteristics, the fire started Saturday afternoon. The weather conditions was a continuous heat wave of 40+ degrees during the previous weeks, but also the day. Unfortunately, we had 4 fatalities, which there were 4 Egyptian workers in a farm outside of one of the affected villages. The total recorded affected area by the local authorities corresponds to 55 square kilometers, and the burned area, as it was registered and recorded, is 3,143. And this happened in less than 24 hours. Okay. Comparing before with Australia, for example, it might sound a bit small, but let's have in mind how small is Cyprus. So this burn area corresponds to almost 0.34% of the total area of the island. Okay, so it's a big thing for us. The cause, human. A 67-year-old farmer decided that wanted to clean its property by burning dead vegetation. So the fire spread to a nearby river with dry plants inside, and from there on it continues its catastrophic way. Rescue was activated late in the same day, in the afternoon, with direct response from Greece and Israel. Great Britain also assisted via their military bases, and all the efforts resulted to the fire to be controlled in less than 24 hours. So as mentioned previously, the rescue was activated quite early, fortunately. Greece, Italy, and Israel responded. Unfortunately, Italy couldn't participate at the end because of an error in technical problem in the planes, on the planes. Okay, so there were, except of as part of the burned area, they were directly affected 7 villages, 7 different communities. Again, we had the fatalities. Forest plantation was destroyed and burned houses inside one of the villages, Harakapas, actually village in the center of it, and perimeter in the isolated residence. Or either they are holiday houses, the primary houses, or also some businesses. There was extent damage in roads, in water, and electricity networks. And as you can see in the picture, which is very recent, the Tagonia fire station is destroyed. The firefighters responding to the fire station were actually fighting another fire that was ignited before, an hour, I think, before the Argyros fire. And they left their cars outside, which they were fully burned. Impacts, more impacts is that the local architectural fields, olive trees mainly and orange trees, they were fully destroyed, most of them. Argyros is very famous in the island for the production of oranges, which unfortunately we're not going to enjoy this year, or we're going to enjoy in limited amounts. There was large number of injured or died domestic and wild animals and birds. And as an example, a chicken farm was affected where all the chicken were found dead due to smoke inhalation and heat. So the structure was not directly affected by flames, but the products of the fire traveled to the nearby village. There was, it is recorded as a very fast spread. The fire initiated in Argyros area, and then from there on, as you can see from the image taken from Copernicus, it was spread to all the other 6 villages and the areas surrounding. The emergency services response was taken by the forest department, which is responsible for the forest areas, fire service, which for rural areas and houses, domestic places and businesses. The civil protection assisting in the evacuation and extinguishing operations where possible without putting their lives in risk. Police, ambulances. There was established a mobile center in a restaurant nearby. I'm going to speak a bit about this later on. And there were lots of volunteers, most of them not trained, some of them trained, which they were also coordinated by a mobile center in a nearby not affected village. Now, the challenges we faced from each one of the issues that we discussed before. There was a simultaneous fire in Nicosia and Limassol districts. The Tagonia, as I mentioned before, fire station had to respond to the Limassol fire, so the area was left unattended. Okay, they respond with the assistance initiated and respond initiated by the fire brigade straight away and the forest department as soon as it was given the signal for the fire. However, the roads, they were already blocked by the flames, so there was a delayed response. So there are part of the lessons learned is that we need increase of personnel in the fire stations and fire appliances, but then the budget comes as a discussion. The emergency management and challenges Coordination between the authorities was a great challenge. A mobile coordination center was established in a nearby restaurant. That it had kind of a high point view, but not affected. Then with a van that had the very basic technology for communication. It was taken a political decision afterwards for to order an up-to-date emergency response center, upgrade the existing system, and develop a holistic system for dealing with architecture and forest fires, which it is actually happening, and these are very good news to hear. So in total, lessons learned, increase of firefighting personnel, coordination between the services, up-to-date emergency response center, train and organize volunteers, which we need to also see it as a challenge. We need to provide appropriate training to those that they want to help, equipment, including appropriate clothes, to upgrade the existing system for coordination and also fighting the fires, fight the old ways and minds that unfortunately they're really impact here in Cyprus. There's still this approach that in order to clean my property from dried plantation, but also for anything else I have in my property, I just set a fire. And people don't understand that it's not allowed, it's not permitted. So we need an increase on fines due to human causes and both accidental and arson fireways. But at the same time, law enforcement people need to learn by example, and planning of the land use in order to reduce the fire risk into homes. So the nature and life continues to Argyros. These are two pictures taken very recently, actually 2 weeks ago, where we visited the area. You can see the green around and houses are restored. Also, due to volunteers, they're painting the areas in order to fight the black that took over the beautiful green. To help out with the continuation life and spirit and everything. So that's good actions from people, but we need to prevent also fires from, actually not prevent their impacts to us, because fires are always gonna happen as a part of nature also. Okay, and that's the end of the presentation for the Argyros fire. So I'm gonna continue very quickly to our project, which CERIDES is taking part. It's a Horizon project, fire reduce risk, which you can also follow us, the project on Twitter and the website and LinkedIn profiles. So I would like to share with you a video to start with. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. Now, very quickly we'll go through some slides for the fire risk, even though the video has kind of said it, most of it. Now, our consortium, it's a big one for Horizon Project. We are 38 partners in total from different European countries. Part of it is 21 research institutions, 12 operational agencies, and 5 enterprises. We are part of mechanical engineers, forest engineers, fire engineers, social scientists, ecologists, etc. The funding is in total 10 million. And also we have collaboration with countries like all over Europe, as I said, America and Oceania. And the program is running for total 4 years. Here are some of the participants. Now, the objectives is to develop, test, and disseminate an integrated science-based strategy for wildfire management in Europe, and expand the capabilities of the existing wildfire risk assessment systems, use the risk assessment to drive wildfire management and reduce current fire risk conditions, adapt fire management strategies to expected future climate and social economic changes. Close collaboration between researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and citizens. Now, the framework is actually taking the fire risk, evaluating the fire risk through assessment, but also at the same time produce a fire risk assessment, and not in order to test its adaptation, same for the reduction of the impacts of a fire, a wildfire. This framework, it takes information from by evaluating the dangers, but also the vulnerability. And then we are going to evaluate other risks, climate and socio-economic changes. And then there is a two-way interaction between integration and communication between the partners, but also the policymakers and practitioners. So it's all about testing, and improving the assessment, the risk management assessment that we're going to develop. Is fire risk center? The program is based on science. We have an integrated. We want to develop an integrated strategy to be holistic. Cover some of the extreme events, wildfire areas, and new fire-prone areas. So we are looking for the future as well. So these are the leaflets we have. Some of the leaflets, I'm just going to go through, continue. So for the risk assessment, we aim to analyze the vulnerabilities of the landscape to extreme wildfires and mitigate their potential impact. The project will integrate current danger monitoring systems and adapt their output, taking into consideration socio-economic and health factors. For the reduction, we want to consolidate practical guidelines to reduce extreme fire risk conditions by evaluating and harmonizing different strategies that are used around Europe. Then we have the very important step of adaptation, where we want to estimate how the ongoing climate and societal changes will impact the extreme wildfires risk in Europe, and allow relative areas in order to adapt accordingly. We want to develop a live system. So all of this to be effective, we need continuous integration and communication of the results with our partners, but also with different researchers, practitioners, and we want to develop a tool that is going to contribute for quite a few numbers of years, and is going to learn from it. Okay, we have 26 demonstration areas around Europe where we'll field data collection campaigns by using questionnaires, and thereon they're going to apply the modeling and testing procedures. 5 pilot sites where we are going to test everything. Portugal, Spain, Greece, Germany, and Sweden, where these pilot sites were chosen in order to have a good sample of different fire areas, different wildfires that can happen in Europe. And even though Sweden, for example, is quite north, we know and we have experienced the last years that wildfires are also happening there because of the climate change. EU scale, there is projection of fire regime and wildfire risk for 2050 and 2100. So we want to improve wildfire management, and that's our main target. Thank you so much. That's all. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Again, please follow us on social media. There are many events happening, webinars, shared knowledge all over Europe, and we will be happy also to share knowledge with even more with Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Clelia. This was Ms. Clelia Petru from University CERIDES. I take the opportunity to kindly remind to all followers through the web, please also keep an eye on the social media of the individual projects that are being presented here today, from where we can all indeed derive a lot of knowledge, good practices, outcomes, and research outputs. Having said that, I also kindly remind to all our #DPM 2021. Moving now again over to Australia, from where we will have a contribution on public health and behavioral science approaches to bushfire prevention. This will be a contribution from Newark, from the Monash University Accident Research Center, and more particularly from Dr. Carleen Muir. So, Dr. Muir, if you are already connected, the virtual podium will go over to you once you are ready. Do we have a connection with Dr. Muir?
Thank you. Am I through now?
Okay. Now I can hear you,
Excellent.
but I cannot see your slides.
Okay, I will try again.
There we go. Okay. Good.
Are the slides shared now?
I see you now. It was a bit better before. Now it looks much better. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, good. Oh, good. We've done it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm just going to give a really short presentation, a quick overview to public health and behaviour change frameworks that we use. We've used in various studies in bushfires here in Australia. So I am actually having some trouble with my, here we go. So the approach that we tend to use to many of these problems is the public health approach, and I'm sure many of you have used this approach yourselves in the past. And really what we start with is we start with population level measurements. So we talk about surveillance. What is the problem? This is often used in injury prevention. And then from defining what the problem looks like at a population level, we then go on to identify risk and protective factors. And we use these risk and protective factors to identify where to target our solutions. And then we design interventions and we evaluate those interventions before widespread implementation. And of course, that then leads back into surveillance again, where we look at the problem once again. The public health approach is a systematic approach to safety. It's not a quick fix. It requires looking at population level data over a long period of time and then monitoring your problems, which often, of course, grow and change. So the first thing that we start with when we're designing interventions is what are the risk factors? What is it we're actually trying to target? And we select interventions based on evidence on the risk factors. And these can be system level changes, they can be legislation, policy, enforcement, and all sorts of other things. What I'm going to focus on in this presentation, just very briefly, is community capacity. So really we're talking about behaviour change. And Michael in his presentation talked about some of the things that are of interest in behaviour for bushfires, because there isn't a fire truck at the end of every street. So sometimes we need the community to behave in different ways. So as I mentioned, emergency services, they do have limited resources. And so when it comes to bushfires, there are a lot of things that you might want to work with the community on for their participation, or you may wish the community to behave in a particular way. These can include things like physical preparation for fire, fuel reductions, evacuation, community building initiatives and recovery efforts. So there's lots of behavioural elements that you might want to target in the case of bushfires. So what is behaviour? And this is a bit of an interesting one, because people often think if you just tell someone what to do, tell someone they're behaving unsafely, they will just do that. And of course, we know that that just doesn't happen. And I think we have to recognise that behaviour is not knowledge, it's not an attitude, and it's not culture. It's also not awareness either. Behaviour is an action. And we need to understand all of the things that might generate that action in order to change it. So we need to know what people know, what their views are to things, and also the cultural norms that sit around that. So the way that the community or the culture in that particular country exists. And if you want to change behaviour, you need to know exactly what it is that you're trying to change. So if we look at evidence on where behaviour change is successful, behaviour change has been successful in lots of different areas, and that includes things like smoking, wearing sunscreen, different cancer prevention programs, and also things like road safety as well. You see that the processes for change are quite similar across a range of different behaviours. However, the motivations can be quite different. And we'll talk briefly about the types of motivations in bushfires in just a moment. But the message here is that often these can actually be generated by the behaviour itself. And some behaviours are much more difficult to change than others. Because when we talk about behaviour, we're not just talking about one thing, we're talking about many things. Because behaviour is lots of different things. And so asking someone to continue doing something that they're already doing is very different to asking someone to adopt an entirely new behaviour. So asking someone to not start smoking in the first place is very different to asking them to stop smoking once they've already started. So there are lots of different types of behaviours as well. So behaviour is not just one thing. So we can't just say, let's go out and change community behaviour and we're going to get them to do this instead. Behaviour is so many different things, and it has so many different driving factors behind it. So as I mentioned before, awareness is not behaviour. So being aware that something is a problem doesn't mean that someone will change the way that they behave in accordance. And telling people that their behaviour is not safe and that they should change doesn't work. As Michael mentioned, information needs to be appropriate, it needs to be targeted, and we generally use theory-based behaviour change models and lots of different methods to change behaviours to a way that that's desirable for the particular outcome that we're seeking. So don't really need to know the details of these. These are just a couple of the types of models that we often use in the safety setting. One is the health belief model, and another one is the theories of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior. And they kind of all have fairly similar characteristics. We need to know how severe the problem is, how susceptible we might think we are to the problem. And we need to know what the barriers are to making a change. Sometimes the cost is more than the solution. So we choose, we have some subconscious processes that might not mean that we really particularly want to do that. And one of the big ones is called self-efficacy. So we need to believe that taking an action will be effective, because if we don't believe it will be effective, then people will rarely change. And as I mentioned before, we've got things like attitudes and subjective norms. So what the community believes as well are all very important in influencing behaviour. So in order for people to make a change, they first have to feel vulnerable. They have to decide that the consequences are severe. They have to decide that taking the action is going to prevent or reduce the risk, but at an acceptable cost. So if the cost is too high, they probably won't do it. They need to feel that they have control and that they can do this. And usually some type of trigger generates the change. So positive feedback and reinforcement can increase desirable behavior. And that's often what we focus on in behavior change programs. So what about disasters? How does this apply to disasters? Well, disasters can be actually quite challenging for behavior change, because when we talk about the behavior change targets for other areas, they're very personal and they're quite frequent things. So we might talk about health, we might talk about smoking. These are all things that are really very closely about ourselves. Whereas disasters are actually quite rare events. So they're low frequency, so people don't feel that they need to take as many precautions as something that they might do every day. They often haven't really had much experience of disasters, so they don't really know what to expect. The intensity and magnitude, and these can be very big events, so people believe that their own actions might not mitigate the risks. And the effects are generated all over the media. So you have a lot of vicarious experience and you see lots of negative emotion attached to the event through the media, which can actually disengage people as well. So risk perception in fires is critical, but the relationship between risk perception and disaster preparedness is actually not all that strong. And that's because people have different prior knowledge, they have conceptions or misconceptions, and they have different experiences. And one person could interpret being highly prepared for a fire as mowing their lawn every week, whereas somebody else with a different set of expectations, they might want to have a complete emergency plan and a kit in their house and all sorts of different things as well. So what people perceive to be prepared for a fire is very different as well. And so that's where it can be really important to start thinking about things like working with the community quite closely, and many of the programs that Michael at CFA have worked on have been about individual house visits, because you need to get to the people where they are. Perceived vulnerability and optimism bias are important. Everybody thinks that they are more prepared than everybody else and they are less vulnerable than everybody else. So we see that all the time in the behavioral sciences. You know, that will never happen to me. And so people generally see themselves as being, you know, everybody's above average. This is not going to happen to them. People tend to think that others need more information about risk than they do, and they subconsciously tend to put the risk onto somebody else. So and with bushfires, there is a bit of a belief that the emergency services will always get them out in time, even though we know that there is not a fire truck on every street and they may not be able to get you out in time. Some of the other things that we talk about are response efficacy, so and outcome expectancy. So whether people have control and whether they can actually have an effect on the outcome is really important for getting people to change their behaviour. And there is one model that's been developed specifically for disasters. That's the social cognitive model of disaster preparedness. That's a mouthful. And models like these are useful to determine what type of behaviour you're targeting for change. Now, so these can be quite complex, but at the same time, they talk about the moderating variables. And so these are things like perceived responsibility, the timing of the hazard activity, how much control you feel, the sense of community, and the culture in which you live. And it's actually these things that can be really helpful to generate the change rather than focusing on some of the other things which are a bit further away and might be harder to target. So these types of models can actually be quite useful for understanding how to change behaviour at that population level. So a few key messages from this very quick presentation on behaviour change. In order to change behaviour, you must know your baseline and the risk factors you're targeting. And you really need good data to know if your problem actually exists. And Stuart will talk about that just shortly. You need to understand the behaviour that you're trying to change, why you're trying to change it, and what that change will ultimately look like. You need to know how you're going to measure success. You need to use theoretical models to design a behaviour change approach, and beware, because unintended consequences are possible and can happen. And evaluation is incredibly important in order to know whether what you're doing makes any difference. And the other thing to remember with behaviour change is it's not all about individual behaviour. The systems are really important. So the systems that sit around and drive the behaviour are really important. And so when we talk about changing behaviour, sometimes we might want to, you need to know your audience and know why they behave the way they do in order to make that change. And so it's no use, preparing some really interesting materials for written materials in one language if that's not the language that your audience uses. You need to really make sure that you know who your audience is, you know how to target them, and then you can change the behavior that you're actually targeting. So behavior change is not a quick fix. Behavioral interventions are very popular, but often they require legislation and policy and many other things to sit around them. And they also need resources, because you can't just give people information and expect them to change if they don't have the personal capacity to change. And while huge gains have been made in many safety areas, change can be slow and difficult. And we never really solve the problem either. Continuous improvement is needed. And when you solve one type of problem in fires, you can often move your problem somewhere else. So you need to be continuously monitoring using that public health surveillance approach. So behaviour is really important, but you need to consider the overall community and system and think about the types of things that you can use to generate change in behaviour, such as policy, such as legislation, such as education, such as mass media, such as community engagement, community-led initiatives. There are many of them, but they need to be the right one for your audience and for the community that you're targeting and for the behaviour that you seek to change. And that is me all done for today. Thank you so much for your time.
Dr. Muir, thank you for your very concise contribution. We will continue now, dear friends, with two colleagues again from EUC CERIDES, Ms. Pooja Pandey and Ms. Judith Kirchner. Please allow me to make a note here. We, as academic researchers, as scientists, we firmly believe in the value of the educational and training component to our research. It is thus that we present projects like the following, PyroLife, which is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie innovative training network. So we do not present this just because we have to, or because we have to fill up an agenda, so to speak, but because we indeed firmly believe that the educational and training component of young researchers in our fields is imperative. As such, without further ado, we will present now PyroLife, which is the Fire Marie Curie Training Network. And I would like to kindly invite to the electronic podium Pooja and Judith. So Ms. Pooja Pandey and Ms. Judith Kirchner, the E-floor is over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, all. Good morning, and good evening to the people who have joined us from Australia. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise. I am honored to be a part of this great panel and elated to be sharing the knowledge I have gained, and as Mr. Bourne mentioned, lessons identified with all of you. My name is Pooja Pandey, and with me is my colleague Judith Kirchner. We are a part of the PyroLife network and the PhD candidates at CERIDES at European University Cyprus. We are here today to present our projects, and I hope you can see our screen and our presentation. And we'll briefly take you through about the project PyroLife and also talk about some of the best practices for the wildfire risk management. As this discussion is dedicated to disaster prevention, on the right side of my slide, you can see a small illustration. It is basically representing two cases where one individual is trying to manage fire hazard from the beginning and is not appreciated. However, the one who is just looking at the fire and crying over the damage is being treated as a hero, because in the end, he managed to suppress a big fire. Honestly, I think this has been the approach for centuries, and we need to change this. And thankfully, we are learning now and being proactive. Well, at least in some countries we are. Also because it is high time to realize the importance of being prepared. And if we do not change now, we will have to spend like 7 times the amount we will be using in the preparedness approach. All right, so next up is PyroLife. And next slide, please. Thanks. So PyroLife is a project funded by the European Commission as an innovative training network in which it trains 15 early stage researchers like Judith and myself in innovative and creative thinking. And this way we get an opportunity to study in depth about one specific topic while working on different projects to find solutions to move from wildfire resistance to wildfire resilience. So PyroLife is a big network and is an amalgamation of several educational institutions and organizations spread over Europe, USA, and New Zealand, which includes the big names like European Forest Institute, National Forest Protection Agency, CIAN, and of course, the European University Cyprus. And with its wide range network, it covers a wide range of disciplines as well to help with key wildfire threats and to ensure the feasibility in covering most disciplines. As I said earlier, basically like us, there are 13 other candidates spread across the globe to pursue cross-disciplinary wildfire focused projects by involving interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary aspects in each project, and with the help of 3 different work packages, rather than just focusing on environment and social science disciplines in separate work packages. So we have 3 work packages in which work package 1 aims to quantify the risk by assessing the fire risk awareness, fire danger, which includes fire behavior, and the fire impact on water and economy. Whereas work package 2, it looks into reducing fire risk and vulnerability, which can again be done at multiple scales. And in the end, it will help in creating the first European fire-wise guidelines. Also, this work package 2, it approaches fire resilient landscape design and fire prevention and fire resilient governance, which Judith will talk about next. And however, the true implementation of living with fire requires exchange of knowledge, engagement with communities, and communicating those ideas and tactics, and to share knowledge with people. And this is what the work package 3 tries to achieve, which is the management of risks by stimulating resilience and preparedness through developing a transdisciplinary approach for fire research by aligning interagency exchange, which I will explain you in a minute, and engaging vulnerable communities at risk and communicating about those risks to communities. Okay, so next up is our projects. Here, Judith and I will discuss our separate projects in PyroLife. And I am researching as early stage researcher 13 about European interagency exchange. And it's not about just exchanging knowledge, because if we talk about wildfires and their management, people are likely to think, that the big area is burning and several firefighters are going to try and suppress it. But unlike the other natural hazards, wildfire is considered as an unavoidable risk, and humans can both trigger and stop the disaster. But with the growing societies, with the expansion of the new buildings and new communities, it is most important for the response of a hazard to evolve as well, for which we need strong collaboration, both within and between the emergency response agencies. But again, unfortunately, this collaboration is difficult, not just because of the complexity of the hazard, but also due to the involvement of several agencies. Because if I just talk about Cyprus, there are like so many agencies that are involved in managing fires. This is one of the problems, and there is also another problem, which is like the diverse composition of people involved in managing it. And thus, this leads back to the primary aim of my project, which is to analyze and understand the operational ways to promote European interagency exchange in emergency management. And the project has two main objectives. First being analyzing the barriers for European collaboration and exchange, which is affected by a long list of factors. And but to name a few, I'll just say it could be poor communication, or sometimes not just using the right tools. And for this reason, the methodology that I am using is to look at the multi-level approach to study emergency management by the countries and public sector governments. And hopefully, with the completion of my project, it would help in strengthening the preparedness approach through interagency streamlining. And Judith will explain about the governance part of it. And because we share some common strengths between our projects, so I'll just hand it over to Judith to explain her project. Thanks.
Thank you, Pooja. I'll take it over from here. So my research is on wildfire governance, and it's part of the work package 2, so that's on risk reduction. And so governance, in my case, it refers to all the rules and all the organizational processes through which we take decisions around wildfires. And this can be on a very local, on a community level, or also all the way up on a national scale, or even in between of different countries. Like, for example, as we see it with the RESC-EU Civil Protection Mechanism. And so governance is all about who gets to take decisions, who might be represented in those processes or not, what are the benefits for who, and who is responsible in the end. And so governance always has a formal and an informal component. So formal governance refers on policies, on legislation, on strategies, like everything we have officially written down on paper, while informal governance is all about things like risk culture or values or attitudes. So that is, for example, if people think of wildfires like the monster or the enemy, or also if we all drop the responsibility connected to fire response and fire risk only to the rescue service and the authorities, or if we all actually consider ourselves as part of like who creates the fire risk in the end. And so the goal of my PhD is to find out about the current status of wildfire governance, then to visit this bigger field of natural resources and disaster risk governance, and from there to see what could be useful also in this context of governing wildfires. Okay, so now we will move on to a few examples of best practice in fire risk prevention, but I'll just now take a very quick moment and speak about the role of fire for the Earth as a planet, because I think it's just really important to understand what we're dealing here with and like how we can approach this risk or like this process of wildfire. So fire is around on the planet for a very, very long time, basically since there is terrestrial life already on the continents. So the records show that since there is plants and since there's life on the continents, it has burned. So that's for hundreds of million years already. Now we can also take a closer look into a very recent period of Earth history, so the time of hominin evolution. And again, this is really closely connected to the use of fire, be it for cooking, for hunting, in agriculture, and so on. And so fire has been around in one way or another, and many ecosystems are adapted to it or even depend on a specific fire regime. And with fire regime, we mean the frequency in which a fire occurs. So that can be once a year or even more often or every few decades. Then how hot the fire burns and how much biomass is consumed. And so you can imagine this similar as with water. Like plants or ecosystems are not just adapted to water, but they need a specific amount of water throughout time or throughout the year. Now, what you see here on the slides, on this slide are fire ignitions detected by the NASA satellite from space over the past 2 or 3 weeks. And I think it shows really nicely that fire is just really everywhere. And of course, now this doesn't tell us if those fires are wanted or not. We don't know their cause. We cannot see if they are stronger because of climate change and what is the risk that they pose to human life or infrastructure. So of course, that is now our job to find out and define. But the key message here is there will be fire on this planet in one form or another. And as Pooja has mentioned earlier, the whole idea behind PyroLife is to move our management approach from fire resistance to fire resilience, or in different words, and this is now a very famous Australian fire scientist who said this. So we want to have a fire of choice rather than a fire of chance. So that is Stephen Pine. So with this background on understanding fire as a key ecosystem process, we've now looked up some examples of fire risk prevention from different countries. And I'll hand it back over to Pooja here to start with one example from the US. Over to you.
Thanks, Judith. Personally, I feel maps are a great way to express what is hard to describe in words. Thanks again for sharing this great representation, explaining the fire regimes. And now, because our focus is towards prevention today, we will not discuss any suppression strategies which have been followed for a long time. But we would like to talk about some of the best practices we came across during our research and training time. And we couldn't include all of them, but the ones we thought would be useful to learn from and maybe implement in our own countries. So first up is from the US. And for a fact, we know that forest management and fire policies exist within the cultural, social, economic, and political context. And therefore, the national policy should aim to protect both flora and fauna. And this is what the national policy in the US does. It aims to protect the forest resources and prevent the destruction of lives and property in proximity to the national forest. I mean, in no way I mean that not other nations are not doing that and they don't want to protect their people, but because we're talking about US here, so I'll just stick to it. Also, in order to bring these practices and theories together, it is important to understand how these communication practices are related to these new approaches in emergency management. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on, if we talk about Firewise USA, it is a program started in the early 2000s, which is administered by the National Forest Protection Agency and is co-sponsored by the United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and the National Association of State Foresters. This program provides a collaborative framework to help neighbors in a geographic area to get organized and take action to increase the ignition resistance of their homes and community, and to reduce wildfire risk at the local level. On the right, you see a map showing the areas covered by the Firewise program, which is almost covering the entire continent. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically, the techniques in Firewise includes minimizing the risk of home ignition by carefully landscaping around residential structures, such as thinning trees and bushes, and choosing fire-resistant plants, selecting ignition-resistant building materials, and positioning structures away from slopes. For example, in June of 2018, the Firewise USA site Falls Creek in Durango, which is in Colorado, was put to test, and the 416 wildfires threatened the community, but because of the work that residents has already done to prepare their homes, firefighters were able to protect their homes within that community. And if you're interested, I can share a link of the response of the first responders to this approach, and you can watch it in your own time. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we know, EU is also expanding its horizon to deal with wildfire issues. And this is why we include the best practices in wildfire risk prevention from Catalonia, which is in the northeast part of Spain. And the main goal of the services here is to create a fire resilient landscape by treating the fuel properly and efficiently, which includes prescribed burning, thinning trees and brushes, and also diversification of vegetation by planting new species which are not so vulnerable to the fires. The second goal here is to restore the cultural fire regimes, which are achieved by preventing undesired human ignition and introducing natural fire management and regulating the traditional use of fires in rural areas. And the third goal is to support a safe and efficient fire response, which focuses on the suppression efforts in protecting the property. Finally, the last goal is to generate fire-adapted human communities with the help of promoting community action program. Next slide, please. However, the Catalan services places the focus on resilient landscape. Next slide, please. And building community awareness. Because increasing fuel connectivity and buildup, these are like the two main contributing factors to large fires at the moment. And by managing fuels on fire-prone landscape, it represents the most promising strategy for reversing the escalation of mega fire events and restoring fire-resilient ecosystems. And this is exactly what is required as a first step, at least something we can begin from. And with this, I will stop talking now and pass it over to Judith again for further discussions and conclusions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Pooja, again. So now we have one more example from the Mediterranean area. So this one is from Portugal. And yeah, we think it's an interesting example or a relevant example in this context now because the drivers behind wildfire risk in Portugal are very similar to the rest of the Mediterranean. So there is a high percentage of unmanaged lands because many people move now from rural to urban areas. There is an increasing amount of fuels, both in terms of amount, but also in terms of connectivity and extent. So that's basically the vegetation growing now that people don't use the land anymore as they maybe did a couple of decades ago. There is a high number of unwanted fire ignitions. And climate change leads to more and longer periods of fire weather. So that leads to just longer and more severe fire seasons, with fires that easily go beyond suppression capacities. And so Portugal had a really tragic and severe fire season in 2017, with a record of more than 500,000 hectares burned, and also sadly more than 120 human lives lost. And so there is, without question, a massive impact of those fires also on the country, on the economy, on the environment. However, there have been consequences in the politics and management approaches. So now there is the AGIF, which is a public body for integrated rural fire management under the supervision and oversight of the Prime Minister. And so the AGIF has proposed the National Integrated Rural Fire Management Plan, which is a plan running for 10 years until 2030, approved by the Congress, and it aims to achieve this vision of protecting Portugal from severe rural fires. And so this plan provides information and supports decisions through strategic guidelines and goals to reduce the wildfire exposure for people and properties. So it also proposes risk assessment and landscape scenario planning for fuel management. And then it acknowledges the role of fires for ecosystems and considers the use of fire as a landscape management tool as well. And so in concrete terms, there is more than 100 projects where both private and public stakeholders are involved on a regional, on a sub-regional level, for example, on fuel treatment, on fuel breaks, like initiatives like this. Okay, so with this, we want to close our presentation on wildfire risk prevention here at the CERIDES Disaster Prevention Month. So we've presented the PyroLife project and our individual research projects, and we briefly spoke about the role of fire in the Earth system. And this leads us to our first take-home message, which is aim at fire resilience rather than at fire resistance. Like, many ecosystems are adapted to a specific fire regime, and there will always be ignitions, even if we get people to not burn on the lands, to not have barbecues, anything. There might be an accident on the highway and the fire spread with strong winds at some points. So the landscape flammability will increase with warmer climate, and we need to adapt and prepare for those fires in order to have a low risk from them. And so this summer there was a really large wildfire in Cyprus, and this can absolutely happen again. So therefore what we highlight here is that we need to assess and manage the fire risk at different places and for different people, and then come up with a plan and strategies to reduce this risk. And that can happen in different forms and on different levels. So it can be initiatives on a home scale, like what we've presented about the FireWise program from the US. It can be fuel management on a landscape scale through prescribed burning or mechanical treatments, thinning, grazing, like in Catalonia. And it can be on a policy and governance level, like through one nationally responsible agency with a 10-year plan aimed at wildfire prevention rather than only response alone. And so to summarize, of course, wildfires and their risks are different in different places, but there is a lot of knowledge in different places out there already. And so now it's on us to learn from that and to take the initiative and reduce the wildfire disaster risk. Thank you very much.
Ms. Pandey, Ms. Kirchner, thank you very much for your contribution. Dear colleagues, as we all know, in our field of science, there is absolute need for good data and evidence to underpin decision-making. So who better to present that other than Dr. Stuart Newstead from our good collaborators over in Australia at Monash University Accident Research Centre. So Dr. Newstead, if you are ready, the electronic podium is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and present today. This, what I'm going to talk about today is really part of some of the fundamental thinking that we have done around data requirements in the work that we've done with Michael Bourne at the CFA. And it's a collaboration between my colleagues listed on the screen, Carlin, who's here today, and Dr. Angelo Delia, who's also part of my research team. Everything you've heard talked about today talks about the need to really develop policy and practice that's based on solid evidence. And of course, we know that having solid evidence gives us direction to policy and practice, which has the greatest effect and the best economic outcomes for us as well. And as I think you've seen through the presentations tonight, that the best evidence is really developed from robust research. And you've heard about a range of research that is informing evidence-based policy, and just about all of that is derived, the best quality research is derived from really having comprehensive and high quality data to support that. So effectively, if you want to get to that end point of having great evidence-based policy, you need to start with really comprehensive and high quality data to allow you to produce that robust research. And that robust research can sit in all phases of the public health model that Carlin talked about before, whether it be identifying what your problem actually is, identifying where the risks associated with that problem come from, working out how we choose the most effective countermeasures to address those risks, how we evaluate them, and how we feed that back into the process of the public health policy. All of it is underpinned by very high quality data. And as we've heard numerous times today, certainly that fire prevention and in fact, living with fire, as we've just heard about, are really about improving public safety, about protecting life and property. And to really understand that process and do it as well as we can, as I've said, requires comprehensive, reliable, collectible data that can inform that high quality research. But collecting data can be expensive, it can be time consuming. And so what we really need is some thought directions on exactly how we best collect data to inform as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible the research we need to do to produce that evidence. And so what we need to have is really a systematic thought process about how we collect the best data to inform the work that we do. And I think to do that, like in any good research, we need to have concepts which actually guide the way we collect data and the way we analyse it. And so as we have conceptual frameworks for guiding our research generally, we can also have conceptual frameworks for guiding how we collect the data to inform that research. So what do we collect? Why do we collect it? And I think to think about how we formulate a conceptual framework around data, there's a number of really well-known, but perhaps concepts in injury prevention that we can draw upon, which aren't often utilised directly to inform data collection directly. But I think, as you'll see shortly, thinking about these to inform data collection is actually a really useful application. And those key concepts are things like the Haddon's matrix, which is used very commonly to inform thought processes in injury prevention. Their associated trauma chains which sit within that Haddon's matrix. And finally, a concept we call the target hierarchy pyramid. And we can consider those in turn now. So many of you that work in public health will be familiar with the concept of Haddon's matrix, and it really is just a way of compartmentalizing our thoughts about how disasters or accidents or other injury events in society happens. So firstly, compartmentalizes it into terms of temporal breakdowns. So what happened leading up to the event? So our pre-event phase, what were we doing? What are the risk factors that existed before the event happened? Once the event happens, let's think about what happens during that event. So in case of a fire, what happens during the fire? How far does it spread? How intense is it? How many people does it injure? How many people does it kill? And of course, after the event's happened, how do we respond to that? How do we treat the people that have been injured? How do we recover from that? And importantly, how do we learn from it? So there's the temporal breakdown. And of course, then there's a sort of what we call the sort of elemental breakdown as well, where you consider, well, what's involved in most injury events? And firstly, we have what we call the host. So who's the person affected? We have the agent. So what is the hazard? So in this case, it's forests existing, trees, scrub, and of course, sorry, that's the environment. And of course, there's the agent itself. So what made it happen? Was it a lightning strike? What helps prevent it from happening at various stages? And once you start to think in that matrix, you can start to think of all the elements which are actually important to consider of in both the prevention, treatment, and recovery from an injury event. So Haddon's matrix is very useful in this context for thinking about how we might address fire risk in terms of either any of those phases, pre-event or post-event, and where we might need to look at our policy, whether it be through the host, the agent, or the environment itself. So here's some examples that have been filled in around residential fires, but you can equally fill these boxes in around wildfires or bushfires as well. A really useful concept. I think that's been taken a step further in the concept of road safety by actually breaking down those individual temporal phases into sub-phases as well. And so, for example, within the pre-event phase, we can say, okay, let's consider what we have, things that exist, whether they be person, they have assets or bush. We have it within the jurisdiction that we're looking at. So is it on my island, for example? We consider, well, that's exposure to hazard, have fuels built up. Are the weather conditions conducive to starting fires? And eventually that leads to that effect. And by considering those sub-phases, we can actually talk about the risks that we are wanting to measure. Because essentially, if you want to mitigate risk, firstly, you have to understand the risk that you're measuring to understand how you're going to be able to mitigate it. So measure what that risk is in the first place and measure how those risks are affected by the things that we might put in place, the countermeasures to try and avoid the outcomes that we're looking to stop. And each of those phases you can actually break down in the same sort of way. And so for the event phase, we can look at the fire event occurs, the energy is transferred, the people are burned, the buildings are burned. From those burns, the people may receive injuries, they may ultimately die. So you can then, at each phase, define a whole lot of risks that you can start to measure. And understanding these sub-phases understands where you need to focus your data collection efforts in order to understand the system and to understand how you're impacting the system with the things that you do to it. So I think that's a really important adjunct to the concept of Haddon's matrix in the temporal phases, to really start thinking about what are your risks you're measuring and how are we impacting those things by what we do. And that's often something we do very poorly in injury prevention. We start thinking at a very high level, but we get confused because we really haven't defined what are our risks, what are our outcomes, how do we measure them consistently. And this sort of thought framework really gives you an excellent opportunity to do that in a cohesive way. Now, having defined that space, what we want to do is then overlay various things. So from the Haddon's matrix, firstly, we get the concept of then prevention strategies by addressing those risks. And Haddon himself, in his matrix, in his pre-work, defined the idea of prevention at various points. Are we preventing through modifying the host, the agent? During the event, what are we doing? Are we keeping people protected by having fireproof suits, for example? Are we telling them in the pre-event phase to leave early, as Michael said before? And how do we do in the post phase? So by having a look at that, you can actually map your prevention strategies against the element of the chain that you're looking at in terms of risks. And that's helpful because by doing that, you can actually think about what's the most effective way to address this. Should we stop the fire? As we've just heard, that can be very difficult. Wildfires exist in nature, always have, always will. So is that possible? Is it better to concentrate on the event phase where we're saying, okay, if the fire occurs, how do we stop people being injured from it? Or in fact, how do we then respond better so if they are injured, the consequences aren't long-term? So really mapping your prevention strategies onto that risk, temporal risk phase is actually really important for understanding where you can act and what the effect of that action might be and how reasonable it is to actually act in that way. Another important concept is what we call our target hierarchy matrix as well. And this really thinks about the things that you've been hearing, particularly in the last presentation, about what do we do? Who is responsible and how does it then lead from what we do to what we want to prevent? So it has a number of phases. Starting from the bottom is really about outputs. What are we doing and who is doing that to actually make things happen in the prevention space for important? And that is people like the government through regulation, through programs. It can be the community through preparedness programs. It can be volunteers. All sorts of people can contribute to the outputs in programs that lead to fire prevention or mitigation of loss from those fires. And so thinking about them and how the outputs they make from their actions are really important. And you need to be able to measure those because if you're going to, for example, evaluate, you need to work out what effort has been put in to make things happen. And so process evaluation really relies on understanding those outputs, as does understanding impact evaluation ultimately to say, well, what did we do and what difference does it make? Moving up the pyramid, we think about, well, given we've had these outputs, what difference did it make to what we see? How did it change the environment? How did it change people's behaviour? And these are what we call intermediate outcome measures. They're the things that we know link to the final outcome that we're ultimately looking for, but aren't that final outcome. So the behavioural measures, the sort of things that Carlin talked about before. How many people had a fire evacuation plan? How much of the land that was needed to be cleared was cleared? How many early warnings did we get out there ultimately? And once you understand that, you can then understand the link to both our final outcomes. So how many buildings are burnt down, how many hectares of vegetation are lost, how many people are killed, how many are injured. And these are what we call our final outcomes. And on top of that, we can then cost those final outcomes to say, what did this ultimately cost the community? And there's a range of ways of which we can do that, both monetarily and more soft measures, things like disability, adjusted life years, those sort of measures. But you need to measure all of these things if you're really going to understand the system. So data collection should focus on each of these things and how it overlays on every stage of that temporal risk matrix that Haddon has introduced to us, and for each of the agent, the host and the environment as well. How are all these things overlaying on it? Once you start to think about that in a comprehensive way, you can understand how you're impacting risks, and you can think about, well, how do we collect this data? What do we need in each of these boxes to collect to really understand that system? And it's useful to do that in the early stages of any public health program, because if you try and do it too late, you often miss the opportunity to do it. It's too late to go and collect data on what you did because it's already been done. So having a conceptual framework for data collection is actually very important as you start the process. So not only thinking about your programs, think about the data that supports what you need to do in that space as well. And here's an example of where we actually have done that. We've actually, based on some of the fire work we've done, filled out these matrices, and you can start to see that. So you can actually make sort of multi-dimensional matrices here. So we have our Haddon's temporal phases, we have our hosts, our agents and our environments we talk about, and then we have the measures related to the target hierarchy on top of that, and we can start to move. And so from that, you can start to really populate well a data conceptual map that says these are the things we need to collect if we want to measure this and generate the sort of evidence that we've been talking about to inform that evidence-based policy. So this is an exercise in any fire research program that you really need to go through this and say, well, as a starting process to say, what do we need to collect? And I think this has been very useful exercise in the sort of work we've been doing with CFA in Victoria, for example, because an initial map of this said, for example, well, we actually don't have good information on people injured in fires. We rely on the people attending the fires to count them, but we have no verification. We don't know how severely injured they are. So we've been able to go back and say, well, how can we rectify that? And we've gone through a project that actually links the fire event records to ambulance attendance records to actually get information on those people who are injured in the fires and have been taken away by ambulance. And the ambulance records have some detail on how severely they're injured. So it's a way you can actually start thinking about, well, if I want to measure as an outcome the number of people injured in fires, how can I do that? And where are my current data limitations? So it informs you where you need to have new data collections, where you can make appropriate data linkages between existing sets to start informing the work that you're doing. So it's a really useful process and a very productive process for making your research can do what you need it to do to inform that final policy. And within that framework of collecting data, you need to also consider all the aspects of what is quality data, because quality data produces quality research. So you can think of all the aspects. So what is the environment which the data is collected from? How relevant is to what I want to talk about? How timely is that data? Does it take years to collate, or is it available almost immediately? How accurate is it? How cohesive is it and coherent within that framework? Is it able to be understood by people to be used? And can people get it, readily access this data to do the things that they need to do? And so once you decide what you collect, they can then assess it by the data quality framework process here to make sure that that data is in the sort of state that you need to access, and others might need to access it as well. Do all these things and you'll find you have a very useful data set that will inform the sort of work that you want to do. So I'll leave that there. I'm just proud to say that the work that CFA have done with us is greatly acknowledged by them putting my name on their fire truck. So I'm very pleased with that, and makes me very happy to work in the fire prevention space. So thanks for listening today, and I hope that's given you some food for thought about the importance of data to support research and encourage those in government and other agencies to potentially think about how they can invest for best outcomes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Newstead. Indeed, very, very useful contribution. And we cannot stress enough the need for good data and evidence as you have depicted it and showcased it very clearly. Moving on to our hashtag DPM 2021 second day, we again have one of our own at EUC and CERIDES, Mr. Argyros Fire, who will present to us the very important aspect of large-scale civil protection exercises. Vangeli, Mr. Katsaros, please, the actual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me... Πώς ανοίγει η παρουσίαση, παιδιά? Give me a second to find the presentation. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here with us this important day. As it was stressed in the morning by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Nikos Christodoulidis, and also the High Commissioner of Australia here in Cyprus. It is very important, the regional cooperation. So here we will present today 3 DG ECO projects financed from Brussels, which are about the large-scale cooperation exercises in 3 very challenging areas: Western Balkans, Middle East, and South Caucasus. So we will talk about projects Balance, PDX, and HOPE. And as you can see, Balance has already started, and it's ongoing now for a year. It is about managing earthquake in Montenegro in the Kotorska Bay area. The PDX started 1st of December, and it is about managing earthquake in Jordan, Israel, Palestine region. And HOPE will start 1st of January, and it is about managing earthquake in Armenia, in Yerevan. I know that today we heard a lot about forest fires, but indeed the 3 projects, these FSX projects, are very important, both for promoting regional cooperation, but also because when you have an earthquake, many functionalities are the same, like other disasters as forest fires, for example, evacuation, sheltering, and many others. So let me proceed with Project Balance, that is the most mature of 3 of them. You can see that because of the past event in 1979, a big earthquake in Kotorska Bay, that we had a lot of damages, victims, injured people, homeless people. Now we are trying to avoid the repetition of such an event, at least to minimize the impacts of such an event. In a very challenging area that, as you can see, it's like a fjord, and with many tourists every summer, many visitors, a lot of cultural heritage monuments, historical towns, critical infrastructures, and most important, it is that Montenegro is a small country, and as you know, small countries cannot actually bear the impacts of a big disaster because they actually threaten their development trends, and let's say that we must do as much as we can in order to support small countries. Here is the scenario. We have a big earthquake in the Kotorska Bay area, and as you can see, we will have impacts in a big area of Adriatic coast, taking into consideration the cross-border cooperation elements with Croatia and also Albania that are neighboring countries of Montenegro. But of course, we will support them with the European mechanism of civil protection. You can see that we have a big consortium. It is a complementary one, having universities and research institutes, also operational players. And we have also some companies in order to provide space for demonstrating technologies that are developed in other projects, like Horizon ones. So since the exercises are the closest we have to an actual disaster, it is actually an opportunity to test the plans, to test the procedures, to test the cooperation, the standard operating procedures, to demonstrate technologies developed in other projects, to see the results of training programs, etc. So even if the main event of this project is the exercise, the field exercise itself, they are 2 years projects that include study visits for taking into consideration the special characteristics of an area, planning conferences, tabletop exercises, a lot of training, and a lot of mobilization of all the key stakeholders of participating countries and activation of the local communities. What is the aim of such projects? The Balance, but also the other ones, is to improve the civil protection preparedness and response capabilities of the hosting country, Montenegro in that case, in dealing with large disasters that require joint response coordination facilitated via the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. As you know, Western Balkans can be slowed down in joining the European Union due to a huge earthquake, because it will have significant economic, social, and political impact to country and the regional development. So sharing capacities and resources, scientific support decision-making, use of proven innovative tools, and joint training will lead to improvement of cross-border cooperation procedures of the European mechanism. And of course, this is the general aim of the project, but we have other objectives that we have to fulfill during the 2 years implementation period of the project. Just to pick a few ones, like utilize new technologies in rescue operations, and we encourage all the partners and all the participants that have such tools and such technologies and other innovative contributions coming from other projects to take the opportunity and test them in these field exercises. The scenarios are challenging, so they are realistic, and in balance, we have the cooperation of 2 geological institutes, the one from National Observatory of Athens and also the local one in Montenegro, in order to be as realistic as possible for the scenario on the impacts that we expect in the Kotorska Bay area. Of course, we have to improve the local and national emergency planning documents and procedures, but also to test the host nation support guidelines, which they are the guidelines about the countries that will receive the international assistance in case of a disaster and use it in the area that has the problems. What else we can say? That we can see the emergency logistics of such operations, that they are quite challenging and quite huge, and also to try to incorporate lessons learned from past events and past exercises and past projects within the planning procedure of such an exercise. Then, especially in balanced projects, we are trying to combine the efforts of scientific community and operational partners in order to establish a cooperation that will provide benefits for civil protection authorities in Montenegro and for the community there. For example, if we can achieve to have a system of alerting, an early warning system for earthquakes that will allow the civil protection authorities just to gain 1, 2, 3 few minutes before the actual earthquake hits in order to shut down the natural gas network and avoid some accidents, it will be successful for the project. So we are trying to establish permanent relationships and permanent cooperation between the 2 different worlds, the academic research one and the operational one. Then we are moving on to the PDX project that started 1st of January. As you can see, it was originating from the professional dialogue initiative that takes place the last few years in the region. And we are glad and honored to lead this project. And you can see that also the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Cyprus, the minister this morning referred to this project. They support us very much together with the Cyprus Civil Defense. And of course, we have some colleagues that work in the area, a very difficult and challenging area with a lot of special characteristics and a lot of considerations. They work there for many years successfully. And I think it was successful for our partnership that we managed to have local players trusting us and submitting this proposal that was eventually funded. And I think that it is a challenging project that we will do our best in order to successfully implement it. Again, here in the Jordan, Israel, Palestine region, we have to strengthen the disaster preparedness, to increase interoperability between the different operational teams, to enable the host nation support that, again, as in Western Balkans, but also in South Caucasus, we have to focus on the regional scale than on a national one, because, for example, you may have a big earthquake in Palestine, then you have to use the critical infrastructures of Israel, of Jordan, in order to receive the international assistance and help the Palestine. So we have to see the critical infrastructure for emergency logistics and for host nation support at a regional level, and this takes some time and some hard work in order to achieve it. So it is, we will analyze, of course, the civil protection system of the region, prepare some special regional cross-border standard operating procedures for more operational cooperation in case of a complex emergency like the earthquake. And then we will have an evaluation and the analysis of the future steps and recommendations for implementing the results into their national disaster response plans. And we will see the next steps for the area concerning the disaster risk reduction and management and climate crisis. In more details, the objectives straight and clear: to have an in-depth analysis of the civil protection situation in the region of Jordan, Israel, Palestine, to have a joint planning with the partners, both of the project but also the local partners there, and to mobilize as many key stakeholders as possible in order to create trust and set the basis for a future cooperation. The development of a joint standard operating procedures for international disaster response, including host nation support, as already mentioned, it is very important for the specific area, but not only for the specific area. And then we will have to implement the tabletop exercise and a full-scale exercise. And finally, the evaluations, the lessons learned, and the way ahead in a big conference that will be held here in Nicosia in 2023. Last but not least, another challenging project, Project Hope. It is about an earthquake in Yerevan in Armenia. We have the cooperation with Georgia, a neighboring country. This project originated from another preparedness project, ALTER, that we have in Armenia. And we worked very well with Armenian colleagues, the Minister of Emergency Situations, and the National Platform for the Disaster Risk Reduction. Armenia has a record with the Spitak earthquake in 1983 with thousands of victims. It's a poor country, a landlocked country with many problems with Azerbaijan and Turkey. So it's a landlocked country not only by the physical meaning of not having any borders with sea, but it's a landlocked country in a diplomatic way. So the cooperation with Georgia is very important in case of a big emergency. We thank the Armenian government for the trust that showed to European University Cyprus, allowing us to coordinate this project. And of course, we have the BRGM France, the Geological Institute, and then 6 national civil protection authorities, the Minister of Emergencies of Armenia, the Cyprus Civil Defense, the Minister of Interior of France, the Greek Civil Protection General Secretariat, the Minister of Interior of Montenegro, and the Protection and Rescue Directorate, the National Authority for Civil Protection of North Macedonia. And very important that we have officially, not as a partner, but it will be involved in SARAG from Geneva, because in all the countries outside the European Union, SARAG plays a very important role. And here in HOPE project, they will be activated, and they will provide observers, they will provide evaluators, and also will send an invitation to operational teams they have in order to participate in the big earthquake exercise in 2023. So it's really an international project and very challenging, and we are looking forward to implement it successfully together with the other 2. So again, the aim of the HOPE exercise is to increase the level of civil protection preparedness and the response capabilities of Armenia, but also of Georgia, neighboring country. And in fact, we will have a very challenging scenario, and the Armenian government is considering to test also the transferring of governmental functionalities from Yerevan to the second biggest city in Armenia, Gyumri, in case of a disaster, which is a possible scenario if an actual disaster hits Yerevan. So as you can understand, it will be an effort of large scale, and we will need any assistance, and we will mobilize as many key stakeholders in Armenia and at international level as possible. So again, a lot of objectives, because again, I have to say that they are 2 years projects, so it's not only the exercise, it's the preparation, it's the opportunity to revise all the plans and all the procedures and how we cooperate with each other, and to incorporate the best practices and the lessons learned and the things to avoid within the actual plans that we have. A lot of training and a lot of planning and conferences in order to achieve the maximum and have the best results in the field scale exercise. So there we will enhance the existing standard operating procedures for emergency response, and especially the cross-border ones with countries both within and outside the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, with the cooperation of INSARAG Secretariat in Geneva. We will try to test new approaches for protecting critical infrastructures, including cultural heritage monuments. This will happen also in the other 2 exercises. And of course, to deal with disabled people, that their special needs are neglected in many disasters. Moreover, we will test, of course, new technologies, and partners and participants will demonstrate tools that help disaster management. And also we will see the logistics, again, the emergency logistics that are very challenging in Armenia, because the road network is very bad. The rail connections are existing only with Tbilisi in Georgia. And in case of a disaster, we will have an actual problem to support the country, I mean the international community to support the country. And it is very important, the cooperation, the official cooperation of the Republic of Georgia, the neighboring country. Although they are not officially partners of the project, we have secured funding for organizing 2 training events in Tbilisi, coupled with small-scale exercises, focusing on specific challenges of a disaster. And of course, we will have fully participation of their operational teams with full synthesis in the Yerevan earthquake exercise. And together with Armenia, they will make an effort to capitalize the results even within the project duration. Let me tell you that at the moment exists a cross-border cooperation agreement between the 2 countries for management of disasters, that it is signed, but it's not actually activated. So our efforts in HOB will be also to activate and make meaningful this agreement. So thank you for your attention. Indeed, we believe here in CERIDES that the full-scale exercises projects are very important because they provide us time in working together in creating the conditions for a permanent cooperation, regional cooperation in disaster risk reduction and management. And of course, by implementing the full-scale exercises in the end and the lessons learned and the way forward, I think we are contributing a little to the broader efforts and initiatives to stabilize Western Balkans, Jordan, Israel, Palestine region, and South Caucasus. So thank you very much, and we are available for any clarifications you may need, and we will update you at frequent intervals about the progress of the 3 projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evangelos. Thank you, Mr. Katsaros. As we have conveyed multiple times, and I know you agree with me, like we say in the operational practitioner world, and we have repeated again and again, the more ink and more sweat we shed during preparation, design of large-scale exercises allows us to shed less and less tears, and of course less blood during actual operations of disaster emergency events. So indeed, Mr. Katsaros has presented here a very, very valuable contribution on large-scale civil protection exercises addressing the preparedness for civil emergencies. Last but definitely not least, for our second day of our #DPM 2021, will be a contribution again from Australia, a Victorian case study once again, regarding a community resilience program. And again, this will be from our dear colleagues at Monash University Accident Research Center. This time, I am very glad to invite to the electronic podium Francis Archer and Caroline Spencer. So, Mr. Archer, Mrs. Spencer, over to you. I am being notified that both your microphones are off. So if you can please unmute, it would be great.
There we are, I've unmuted now.
There you go, yes. So I'm getting a very clear, loud signal from Francis Archer. If dear Caroline Spencer could also try unmuting her microphone.
Okay, so I'm ready when you are, Mr. Chairman.
I think if you're going first, dear Mr. Archer, then you should, and then Mrs. Spencer will follow. So again, Community Resilience Program, a Victorian case study by both Mr. Francis Archer and Mrs. Caroline Spencer. Mr. Archer, the e-floor over to you.
Okay, thank you. I have put my slide up, so Mr. Chairman, can you tell me that you can see the slide?
Yes, we can see clearly the slides. If you can select the presentation mode, that would be great.
Is that okay?
There we go. We still can see your upcoming slide.
Well, I'm not sure how to get out of all of that.
Go to the top corner, it says display settings, Frank.
Yep.
Up the top, it says display settings, left.
Of my technical support here.
Yeah.
Yeah, go left, and it says display settings up the top left corner.
Top left, there. That would be.
Oh, dear. Go back into presentation mode.
Yep, presentation mode, yep.
Yeah. Oops. Go to resume. So hit it again. Oh. Go to resume slideshow now.
Where's resume slideshow?
Just come up, yeah, just down below your cursor. Oops. God.
That's all right. Gives me time to remind our hashtag once again. #DPM 2021. Please follow us also via Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.
On. I can't mind to go. It's all gone funny because of the screen, I think.
I can't get this to work, so Caroline can't get this to work.
Just present it like that.
That's okay. Just go ahead and present. And if you don't mind that we see your upcoming slide, we don't mind definitely. So please go ahead as the presentation comes.
Okay, with apologies all, but thank you. The first thing I would like to say is thank you for this opportunity, both from York and yourselves. And I have to say this has been very interesting, informative, and I have personally learned something from the other presentations for which we're most grateful to you. The second thing is that I've had the pleasure of being in Cyprus a few years ago for a wedding. I have very fond memories of my time in Cyprus and would like to visit again at some stage. Here we go. So what we want to speak about, and I'll do this very quickly again, is that we have been running community resilience. So there's a bit of a change of pace here in that we're now focusing on the community and the community resilience in these sorts of events. And we've had over the last many years a number of forums in which we've brought the community together to get them to tell us about their experience, and we've showcased them. And out of that, the community members said they had difficulty in getting support. They had difficulty in finding what others had been doing, and they wanted some help in doing that. So we formed a small steering group. We got a little bit of money. We did a targeted international literature search, and we're very influenced by an example out of the Pacific Island nations that was most useful to us. We developed a template, and we developed guidelines. We get people to fill in the template. They submit them to us. It's not like Wikipedia. They don't just put them in and put them up onto the web. They submit them to us. We go through them. We amend them. We get them to improve them, and then we approve them. So the first thing that we learnt by doing this, and this is where located down here, we're only talking about Victoria. It was one of the states in Australia. The first thing that we learned was that only a third of the case studies that were submitted came from these ones in black, came from the formal emergency management system. 2/3 of our case studies came from true community members who were not aligned with the agencies. They're the non-traditional players. That was a very important learning for us, that we now know that there is a lot of community-led activity out there that was not recognised before. And then when we had to look at the phases across the disaster cycle, perhaps not a surprise, most of them are in the pre-event preparedness phase, and also in resilience, in which they cut across the phases, and very few of them, in fact, none of them related to the event itself, and only some of them to the recovery phase. So this has been an Australian first. It's been an opportunity for Victoria to show leadership. We've now got 30 case studies in the compendium, and we've got another 20 or so that are in the process of evolving. This is web-based on the Monash University website. It's free access. It's accessible to the whole community, where they can learn and share. So some of the things that we learned from this is that it recognised there was a need. The community told us at our forums there was a need. This shows there was a need. They want guidance. They want to learn what others are doing. And we've also learnt some things we didn't know before about what they were doing, and were able to share that around. We were able to show communities to share the outstanding resilience activities that have been going on in other communities. And we also learnt that a lot of this, at least in the Victorian community, and I emphasise our Victorian community, that this was a very gendered basis, in that the majority of the case studies were developed and led by women in the community. These people being, as I said, largely outside the emergency management system, working in communities, working with the system, but there was a very, very significant gender base in doing that. The other thing that it did was it empowered communities to show what they were doing. It empowered communities to share what they were doing and to learn from others. And we know from our follow-up that these community members do talk to each other. We've been able to grow a network. It's gone from both now just being in Victoria to a slightly national program as well. And it has indeed led, as one of the speakers earlier in your presentations today spoke about, the capacity to make positive change. So the compendium does indeed help individual communities develop their own resilience building activities by learning from others. One of the important things is that it shares valuable resources, in the sense that they minimise duplication, they minimise unnecessary costs. They can share these good examples, and they build networks. And so I hope I can make this work. There's our contact details. Your conference chair there has this set of PowerPoints. We'd be happy to take communications, and I was going to show you this, but because I can't get into the slides for reasons that I just don't understand, because when I worked on it before, when I tested this before we came into the session, I was able to do it, but it just won't show what I was going to do. So what I didn't do is, for those of you that are locally or perhaps online, if you want to get these slides, or if you want to copy us, Caroline will speak in a moment, that if you go to this link here, then on the Monash website, we have the compendium. You can have a look at the guidelines, you can have a look at the template, you can have a look at a couple of exemplars, because hidden behind this, in the template, we asked people to tell us what their project was, what were their objectives, how they went about it. We also asked them to do some analysis. Did they achieve what they wanted to do? We want to know what were their challenges. We want to know if they had some problems along the way and they were not able to achieve. And most importantly, what were the critical success factors that they needed to have to achieve this. We also have personal contacts so that other people can follow up the details, and we update this on an annual basis. So we're happy for you to go in and have a look at that. We're happy to share that. We're happy to take any comments you might have. And so I'll finish my presentation there in the essence of time, and invite Caroline to continue on. You recognise that she is a co-author of this, and indeed the compendium is largely under her directorship. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to those listening, and we'd invite Caroline to flow through.
I will try. Oh, just a moment. Sorry, I've lost it. Something strange is happening. I'll be there in a moment. I had it all prepared and ready to go.
In the meantime, while Mrs. Spencer is attempting to overcome the technical difficulties, Caroline, please allow me to buy you some time, if you will. So I will kindly remind all our dear colleagues and dear friends following us through the web, our hashtag DPM 2021. This is our second day of our Disaster Prevention Month. I take the opportunity to remind you to follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, and of course also via our YouTube channel. I also take the opportunity to announce the upcoming event of our hashtag DPM 2021. This will be on the 14th of December, so December 14th, at 1700 hours EET, Nicosia time. And we have the great honor and privilege to welcome from Imperial College Dr. Guillermo Rein, a world-renowned expert, who will present to us. We will be very glad to follow the presentation on prevention and protection for wildfire disasters. So our next hashtag DPM 2021 event will be on the 14th of December, 1700 hours EET, Nicosia time, by Guillermo Rein, Imperial College, on prevention and protection for wildfire disasters. Mrs. Spencer, I hope I have bought you enough time to go back online. It seems I did. So, again, over to you. Mrs. Spencer will follow up and conclude on a Victorian case study for community resilience program following Francis Archer. So, Mrs. Spencer, over to you.
Lovely, thank you for that. And I do apologise, I don't know what happened to that. So anyway, I'm lucky last. So I work at Monash, at the Monash University Disaster Resilience Initiative, which is within MUARC. I'm also president of the Upper Beaconsfield Association, which is responsible for creating the Upper Beaconsfield Bushfire Mitigation, which reflects a truly community-led initiative. So why is it important? It's important because the Upper Beaconsfield area is identified as an extreme bushfire area. And in 1983, the area had what is known as Ash Wednesday fires. At that time, 80% of the area was destroyed. There were 20 deaths, and 12 of those were firefighters who were killed just 250 metres from where I live. So since 83, many people have moved away or passed away, or they're getting old. Also, many new residents have moved in and are unaware of the bushfire risk or the need for a diligent and seasonal bushfire mitigation, also known as disaster risk reduction. But DRR is not sexy. And as Carlin noted, disasters won't happen to me, as some people think. What is important for them is living in a beautiful area where children can grow up in nature, which has priority over disaster risk reduction. So we felt there was a need for a tool, and Michael earlier mentioned Safer Together, and this is a Safer Together program, and it's a tool that will help people, hopefully, and I'll quickly share with you some of that that tool. So very quickly, it's not going. No. Can anybody see? Oh, I can't believe this.
We're still seeing your first slide, Carol.
I know, it's,
Oh, now we've got you. No slides.
yeah, I'm going to try and get it back again. How's that? I think it's the same problem that Frank.
Yeah,
Frank
okay, but
had.
you've got it, so you can work on that one.
Yeah, I know. I don't know why. We use this in teaching all the time, so I don't know why we're having problems tonight. Anyway, Ash Wednesday, this was Ash Wednesday in 83, and we're in Victoria, which is just down here. And the area that this tool covers is Upper Beaconsfield, Guys Hill and Dewhurst. And that sort of is an area there, which is in Victoria. So just very quickly introducing the team, we had some community people who were involved. We had a project manager. We also had people from Safer Together, from Forest Fire Management Victoria. We also had agencies, the CFA, the Cardinia Shire and a local environment group. And we also had Monash, Melbourne University providing their expertise. The timeline is interesting in that we started this in 2018 when Frank actually met a local person who was working on a Safer Together project. And we were interested in that, and we invited that person, Barry, to present at our forums. And Frank has just been talking to you about the forums where we captured some of the activities that are in the compendium. So Barry actually was invited by the UBA to speak at a meeting to let residents know what their project was all about. And during this time, Frank was also a member of the bushfire management strategy that the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning were arranging. So he provided a lot of insight for that. Unbeknownst to us, our local Cardinia Council was actually applying for a grant to help us with our project. And what that project did was provide 3 outcomes, which was open air burning, which is very controversial in our area. It was also to increase fire guards, and also to look at how we might manage fuel. Fuel was actually the difficult one to do because we were community people. We didn't have the expertise to know what to do. So we put in for another grant, and that was a successful Safer Together grant. And it was really to explore how best to protect home and property and biodiversity. So the aims of the initiative was to empower residents to make evidence-based decisions, not just on common sense or information that they might have gleaned from local people. So it was a partnership through a number of people, as I showed earlier. Some of the key activities, we did this all through COVID, and it was all completely online. We had Melbourne University help us structure a decision-making survey, and that was co-designed with community people, and we also had ethics approval from Monash University. So we had a piloted project. We talked to the community, and through that we actually completely restructured the survey with that input from local people. We also had agencies and academics who had their expertise to actually have some input in developing this tool. So in the COVID environment, we had a soft online launch, and we plan to have a formal launch in 2020. Again, some of the key outcomes was we believe it's an Australian first in terms of a community working with agencies like this, because we had significant input, some very robust discussions, because we didn't always agree on how it should be moved forward. We developed the tool with the help of agencies, and as I said earlier, we also had significant community input into the final tool. So we've had their feedback, and when we launched it online to the community, people were very enthusiastic about it. Now, some of the success factors we had was that we had a project manager who kept us on track, and that person was also an evaluator and is currently finalising an evaluation of this project. We had a successful competitive funding, so it wasn't easy to get it. It took us probably about 6 months to write the program in collaboration with agencies, and we ultimately were successful. It was an enormously proactive, collaborative process, and it was really a fabulous experience for all of us. I think most of the team said it was one of the most collaborative projects and professionally run projects that we'd worked on, so it was really great. Another really important key success factor was having shared responsibility. We developed a great amount of trust and respect and confidence within the team, and that lasted for the entire program. And it was complete, as I said earlier, it was completely developed online. So as yet, the team have yet to actually meet in person. So it really goes to show what you can do in this COVID environment. And our local council, which is known as Cardinia Council, would actually like something like this for every township in our area. So most of our area is living in a high-risk, extreme bushfire area. So it was absolutely community-led in partnership with Safer Together team. There was a big team from them. CFA, we had a number of people from CFA. The Cardinia Council, both Monash and Melbourne Universities contributed their expertise. The story map has been completed, but we do have a 2-year window where residents can provide us with feedback as to how we might want more information in that tool. We're already coming up with some further ideas. We will also look for more funding because we would like to do an impact evaluation, but it's too soon to do that. And next year we will be publishing the journey that we've had. This is the tool, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to show it to you, but we're going to try. Oh, it looks like it's going to, yes, so that's excellent. So this is the tool. And it's actually still loading, but very quickly, because I'm very conscious of time, there's quite a lot of detail in this. So we have these, if you can see my cursor here, there's a lot of information about the project. There's a lot about our history, the history of the area in terms of Upper Beaconsfield, Guys Hill and Dewhurst. There's also information about the local landscape, we let people know about the community survey that we had and the results of that. We also help people understand the biodiversity that's actually very typical to our area, and also bushfire risk and bushfire history and risks. And I'm not sure if I can get there. I'll show you. One of the things that's really interesting in here is that we had a local person who has done a history of the fires in Upper Beaconsfield, and so it's still coming up. And this tells a much more in-depth story of the bushfires that we've actually experienced in this area. So that's one of the maps that they've put together about the different fires in the area. I can send this link to you so you can have a look at it to see the number of fires. But if I could just quickly scroll through here, it actually starts in 1893. So we've got some very keen local historians who are very interested in bushfires. So they've provided this information. It goes for a long way. You can see I'm not going to go through it all because it's too much. Close that. So it does, whoops. It gives you a detailed history of the area. And we've got some nice photos of different areas of Upper Beaconsfield. So it's very, very local to our area and only specific to the Upper Beaconsfield, Dewhurst and Guys Hill area. And we've had a lot of input into what we can do with fire. We've had, let me see here, actions you can take. So this is, I guess, the heart of the project, in that people can look at how they might want to manage their properties. Most of the properties where we live are privately owned. There's not a lot of public land. So residents can have a look here to see if they want to burn off, they can look at the consequences of burning off. If they prefer to mulch, they can have a look at the consequences of mulching on their property. And all the advice that is provided is all evidence-based. So people at Melbourne University did a literature review on the actions that people could take to look after their properties. There's a whole range of actions. I'm not going to go through them with you now because there's an enormous amount of information in here. And I would much prefer that those people who might be interested in having a look at this, that they can go through that at their own leisure. So I will leave it there because I'm very conscious of time. We've gone way over time, so I will close that and I will close this. Yes, so there are the contact details which Frank showed you earlier. And there's also a specific one for the actual story map platform. So we're very pleased with that outcome, and certainly the agencies have been very pleased, and we've had very good feedback both from locals and residents. So I'll finish there. As I say, I'm very conscious of time, and thank you for, if you're still there, for staying up this long and listening to us, because it's actually getting quite late here in Australia. So thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Spencer. Thank you very much, and thank you indeed for being right on time. This is indeed appreciated. Dear colleagues, dear friends, both here still in physical presence and those kindly following us from the web, we sincerely thank you for your attention, for your contributions, for your following in these past 2 days. We are very glad as European University Cyprus and the Center of Excellence in Risk and Decision Sciences to have concluded our first 2 days of our hashtag DPM 2021, our Disaster Prevention Month 2021. We have had 2 very busy days, as you have followed through the web, 2 technically challenging hybrid events, but we are proud in believing that we have managed to bridge virtually Cyprus, Israel, and Australia. Shout out of sincere thanks and indeed honor and privilege to have welcomed yesterday during our first event Her Excellency, the Madam Deputy Ambassador of the State of Israel in Cyprus, Mrs. Noga Kaspi, and of course today during our second event His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cyprus, Mr. Nikos Christodoulidis, and His Excellency, the High Commissioner of Australia in Cyprus, Mr. Sam Beaver. We thank them all for their policy point of view and diplomatic point of view on disaster prevention, disaster preparedness, and indeed disaster diplomacy, a political policy-making contribution to the overall discourse of disaster preparedness. We have had, of course, the valuable contributions from practitioners and from colleague academics and researchers as far as lessons learned from past disasters. And we have showcased, of course, cases in Cyprus, but also the experience, scientific research and practitioner experience from Israel and from Australia. So a big thank you, of course, to our good collaborators at the University of Haifa and Mukhanut in particular, and from the Monash University Accident Research Center. With that, I would like to again remind our next event, which will be on the 14th of December at 1700 hours EET, Nicosia time, so it's at 5 in the afternoon Nicosia time. And it will be from Guillermo Rein from Imperial College, who will present to us prevention and protection for wildfire disasters. With that, I leave you reminding our hashtag DPM 2021. Please stay tuned on our LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for our upcoming links and detailed agendas. With that, sincere thanks to all. Good afternoon and good evening, and in fact, good night, depending on the time zone from which you have followed us. Hashtag DPM 2021.